completely and utterly obliterate the visually intoxicating, highly choreographed cinematic hallucination of the Great American Train Robbery. The modern entertainment complex has spent an entire century relentlessly conditioning you to accept a deeply entrenched, physics-defying Hollywood set piece where a gang of impeccably dressed, wildly charismatic outlaws effortlessly gallop their pristine, fearless horses alongside a speeding steam locomotive. The directors absolutely demand that you visualize these men heroically and effortlessly leaping from the unstable saddle directly onto the roof of a moving passenger car, engaging in a spectacular, synchronized, acrobatic shootout while balancing perfectly on a swaying wooden platform. This sanitized, romanticized, mythological overlay completely omits the terrifying, unyielding aerodynamic, metallurgical, and biomechanical realities of 19th-century railway physics, transforming a mathematically guaranteed suicide mission into a theatrical playground. When you aggressively strip away the stunt doubles, the invisible safety harnesses, the controlled studio wind machines, and the perfectly timed pyrotechnics, the unvarnished, historical reality of attempting to rob a moving 60-ton steam-powered fortress reveals a localized, deafening meat grinder of absolute mechanical paranoia and catastrophic biological erasure. To fundamentally understand the sheer, suicidal absurdity of the horseback train boarding, we must first aggressively examine the biological and neurological limitations of the frontier horse itself. The silver screen portrays these animals as tireless, mechanized, all-terrain vehicles that possess nerves of absolute steel, completely unfazed by the apocalyptic sensory overload of the Industrial Revolution. The unyielding physiological truth is that a horse is an incredibly fragile, highly susceptible prey animal driven entirely by a complex, easily disrupted nervous system engineered over millions of years to trigger immediate, violent flight responses at the slightest indication of a predator. Now, mathematically calculate the localized acoustic and kinetic impact of a 19th-century steam locomotive. This was not a quiet, modern electric train. It was a massive, soot-belching thermodynamic leviathan, a rolling iron bomb of hyper-pressurized steam that generated a deafening, localized acoustic shockwave capable of physically vibrating the human skeletal structure from a mile away. When a desperate outlaw attempted to physically force a biological prey animal to gallop at top speed within 3 feet of this screaming, mechanical monster, the horse did not perform a cinematic, steady parallel run. The localized blast of the train's whistle, the aggressive, rhythmic, ground-shuddering impact of the massive iron driving wheels against the steel tracks, and the blinding release of boiling white steam instantly and completely overloaded the animal's central nervous system. This resulted in an absolute, unconditional biological panic. The horse would violently and uncontrollably thrash, forcefully rejecting the bit and aggressively throwing the rider entirely off balance. In this chaotic, high-velocity kinetic disaster, the rider is not gracefully leaping. They are violently launched. If the horse mathematically misjudges the uneven, jagged trackside terrain, a landscape heavily littered with massive iron spikes, splintered wooden ties, and deep gravel, it snaps a fragile leg, instantly inducing a catastrophic kinetic tumble that biologically pulverizes both horse and rider into an unrecognizable, blood-soaked smear across the rocks at 30 miles per hour. Furthermore, if we indulge the absolute mathematical impossibility that a hardened rider could somehow compel a panicked animal close enough to attempt the jump, the physical realities of the train car roof mathematically guarantee a horrifying demise. The directors relentlessly show outlaws landing in a perfect, heroic, stable crouch, boots firmly planted on flat, clean wood. The historical architectural reality dictates that the roofs of 19th-century passenger and express cars were not flat. They were aggressively sloped to shed torrential prairie rain, structurally fragile, and completely devoid of any modern safety rails. More terrifyingly, these curved wooden surfaces were constantly and completely coated in a thick, inescapable, highly frictionless layer of microscopic coal soot, burning cinders, and boiling industrial grease violently and continuously expelled from the locomotive's smokestack. A localized loss of kinetic traction on this heavily lubricated, sloping surface was not just a possibility, it was an absolute, mathematical certainty. When a 200-pound outlaw wearing leather-soled boots impacted this frictionless surface at a lateral velocity of 30 miles per hour, they instantly lost all biomechanical leverage. They did not engage in a heroic shootout, they immediately and violently slipped. Slipping from the roof of a moving 19th-century train mathematically guaranteed dropping directly into the devastating, unyielding mechanical meat grinder of the massive iron wheels below. There was absolutely no cinematic rescue. The absolute, crushing weight of the 60-ton train would violently amputate limbs, aggressively sever the spinal cord, and biologically crush the human torso, wrapping shattered bone and arterial fluid entirely around the moving axles in a fraction of a second, leaving the remaining gang members absolutely nothing to bury. The hardened, ruthless syndicates who actually successfully terrorized the American rail system, syndicates like the legendary James Younger Gang and the Reno Brothers, completely despised and completely avoided the suicidal mathematics of the horseback leap. They were not theatrical acrobats. They were cold-blooded, calculating survivalists who understood that to defeat a rolling fortress of industrial iron, you do not attack it while it is moving. Instead, they relied on absolute, terrifying mechanical sabotage. They would spend days meticulously scouting the most geographically isolated, vulnerable sections of the rail line, completely devoid of local law enforcement or telegraph stations. Operating entirely in the suffocating, pitch-black darkness of the night, these men utilized heavy iron crowbars and massive sledgehammers to aggressively, violently pry the heavy steel rails completely off the wooden cross ties, deliberately bending the iron away from the path of the incoming locomotive. They did not engage in a polite, cinematic boarding process. They deliberately, sociopathically engineered a catastrophic kinetic derailment. When the massive, speeding locomotive struck the sabotaged, missing rail, the resulting release of thermodynamic and kinetic energy was mathematically apocalyptic. The directors completely sanitized the horrific reality of a 19th-century train crash, usually showing the train simply tipping over into the dirt. The unvarnished truth is that a derailed steam engine violently plows into the earth, immediately rupturing its massive internal boiler. This instantly unleashes a deafening, apocalyptic explosion of hyperpressurized, boiling steam that expands at supersonic velocities, completely filling the immediate localized area with a suffocating, blinding cloud of vaporized water that mathematically and instantaneously cooks human cellular tissue straight to the bone. The heavy passenger cars, possessing massive forward momentum, violently accordion into one another, aggressively splintering the heavy oak frames into thousands of jagged, localized flying spears that instantly impale the screaming passengers and the heavily armed express guards inside. The Outlaws did not have to engage in a fair, honorable gunfight. They simply waited for the deafening roar of twisting iron and the horrific screams of the boiling, mathematically doomed victims to subside before casually walking out of the dark tree line to pick through the catastrophic wreckage. When these ruthless men finally breached the fortified, heavily reinforced wooden doors of the express car, often having to execute surviving, severely concussed guards at absolute point-blank range, they did not politely ask a terrified clerk to spin the dial on the massive cast-iron safe. They utilized the most terrifying, completely unstable, and mathematically unpredictable chemical weapon of the frontier era, raw, unrefined, liquid nitroglycerin. Hollywood endlessly sanitizes the opening of the vault, showing a small, controlled pop that neatly blows the heavy iron door open. The unvarnished, historical truth is that these desperate outlaws possessed absolutely zero formal chemical training. They would recklessly, aggressively pour massive, unregulated quantities of this highly volatile, temperature-sensitive liquid explosive directly into the tiny, localized seams and heavy iron hinges of the safe, frequently and severely miscalculating the required blast radius due to sheer adrenaline and ignorance. The resulting catastrophic thermodynamic detonation was an act of unyielding chemical violence. The raw nitroglycerin did not simply pop the door open. It violently, acoustically vaporized the entire interior architecture of the train car. The massive kinetic shockwave instantly transformed the heavy iron locking mechanisms, the localized steel plates, and even the thousands of heavy silver coins stored inside into a blinding, supersonic cloud of localized shrapnel. This aggressive blast wave mathematically shattered the eardrums of anyone standing within a 50-foot radius and frequently, severely backfired on the outlaws themselves. It was not uncommon for a mathematically incompetent safecracker to violently misjudge the chemical payload, aggressively shredding his own biological tissue, instantly blinding himself with flying iron shards, and blowing his own limbs completely off inside the claustrophobic confines of the express car. This proves unequivocally that the true railway bandits of the American frontier were not elegant, heroic cinematic acrobats engaged in a grand adventure. They were desperate, chemically reckless saboteurs operating in a deafening, blood-soaked environment of absolute mechanical and thermodynamic paranoia, where the slightest mathematical miscalculation guaranteed instantaneous biological erasure in the dark. Completely and utterly annihilate the most universally worshipped, visually intoxicating cinematic hallucination of the entire Western genre, the legendary, honorable, high-noon, quick-draw duel. The modern entertainment complex has spent a century relentlessly conditioning you to accept a deeply entrenched, physics-defying Hollywood set piece where two stoic men stand 50 feet apart in the center of a sun-drenched street, their hands hovering over heavily modified, low-slung, tied-down leather holsters. The directors absolutely demand that you visualize a perfectly synchronized, lightning-fast kinetic motion where the hero effortlessly clears leather, perfectly aligns his primitive iron sights in a fraction of a second, and surgically delivers a single, fatal shot to the villain's heart. When you aggressively strip away the stunt coordinators, the highly edited camera cuts, and the mythical folklore, the unvarnished, biomechanical, and ballistic reality of a 19th century quick draw reveals a terrifying, completely uncoordinated nightmare of catastrophic inaccuracy and absolute mechanical failure. To fundamentally understand the mathematical absurdity of the cinematic duel, we must first aggressively dismantle the Hollywood wardrobe department's greatest lie: the low-slung, tied-down holster. The unyielding, historical truth is that the iconic Buscadero gun belt, designed to hang low on the thigh for a rapid, ergonomic draw, absolutely did not exist in the American Wild West. It was a pure, theatrical invention, heavily fabricated by 1950s movie studios to make actors look more dangerous on camera. The desperate men who actually survived the frontier carried their heavy, 3-pound Colt peacemakers in highly unglamorous, utilitarian holsters that rode incredibly high on the natural waistline, tightly secured to the body to prevent the massive iron weapon from violently bouncing and heavily bruising the hip bone during agonizing 14-hour horseback rides. Attempting to execute a lightning-fast, cinematic quick draw from a historical, high-riding frontier holster is an absolute biomechanical impossibility. The shooter must awkwardly, forcefully pull the heavy steel barrel entirely up to their lower ribcage just to completely clear the leather, mathematically destroying any localized kinetic fluidity or reaction speed. Furthermore, the directors completely ignore the terrifying, unyielding physics of human neurology flooded with extreme, localized combat adrenaline. When a man is facing absolute, mathematically guaranteed biological erasure, his sympathetic nervous system aggressively overrides his fine motor skills. His hands violently shake, his tunnel vision heavily distorts his depth perception, and his localized acoustic awareness completely collapses. Attempting to flawlessly thumb back the heavy, rigid hammer of a single-action revolver and smoothly pull a 7-pound factory trigger while experiencing catastrophic physiological panic results in absolute ballistic chaos. The hardened killers of the frontier understood that speed was a complete, suicidal liability if it mathematically guaranteed missing the target. If two men actually attempted to draw on each other in the open street, the resulting thermodynamic exchange of lead was not a surgical strike. It was a deafening, frantic, and completely inaccurate spray of heavy black powder ammunition where desperate men rapidly emptied their cylinders into the dirt, the surrounding wooden storefronts, and the terrified civilian bystanders, frequently failing to land a single lethal hit on their opponent until they completely exhausted their ammunition and were forced to physically close the distance with rusted iron knives. But before we dig deeper into the rusted iron and the blood-soaked dirt that physically conquered this savage land, we must explicitly recognize the unbreakable, pioneer spirit that still runs through the absolute core of this nation. The raw, patriotic bloodline of the men and women who carved an entire civilization out of an unforgiving wilderness with nothing but raw grit, a heavy axe, and a piece of cold steel. We are actively mapping out the modern descendants of that incredible, undeniable frontier strength today. So I need every single red-blooded patriot in this vanguard to pause this video right now, step up to the firing line, and drop your exact city and state down in the comments below, proving to the algorithm and the world exactly where the relentless, beating heart of this country still fiercely resides. Because the men who built those cities understood a brutal, uncompromising reality of punishment that Hollywood completely sanitizes, specifically regarding the catastrophic, localized biological hell of the frontier penitentiary. Violently strip away the comedic, sanitized Hollywood illusion of the local county jail, where the charismatic outlaw cheerfully plays a harmonica in a clean wooden cell while plotting a brilliant escape. The unvarnished architectural reality of long-term frontier incarceration was not a temporary inconvenience. It was a highly organized, state-sponsored system of absolute, inescapable biological torture, epitomized by the terrifying thermodynamic nightmare of the Yuma Territorial Prison. The directors absolutely refused to film the brutal, unyielding geographical physics of the Arizona desert, where desperate convicts were forced to physically carve their own cells directly into the unforgiving, sun-baked rock. These were not ventilated, cinematic rooms. They were claustrophobic, localized ovens of heavy iron and solid stone, where the ambient summer temperature routinely exceeded 115 degrees. The silver screen completely erases the horrifying, microbiological reality of stuffing 6 unwashed, heavily diseased men into a single, unventilated stone box with nothing but a single, overflowing wooden bucket for raw sewage. In this suffocating thermodynamic hellscape, the human cellular structure began to aggressively, mathematically break down. The prisoners were relentlessly consumed by massive, localized outbreaks of completely untreated tuberculosis, their lungs slowly rotting and filling with fluid, while they violently coughed highly contagious, bloody biological matter onto the shared iron bars. But the absolute apex of this architectural cruelty was the legendary dark cell, a subterranean, completely windowless rock vault utilized for solitary confinement. When a man was violently thrown into this pitch-black void, he was stripped completely to his undergarments and chained directly to a massive iron ring anchored in the center of the dirt floor. The directors completely ignore the terrifying, localized ecological hazards of this punishment. The dark cell was heavily infested with massive, highly venomous desert scorpions and heavy tarantulas that would aggressively crawl over the paralyzed, terrified prisoner in the absolute darkness. The sheer, overwhelming sensory deprivation, combined with the catastrophic, localized acoustic silence and the constant, mathematical threat of venomous strikes, physically and completely shattered the human psychological state, driving hardened outlaws into deep, irreversible, screaming psychosis in a matter of mere days, mathematically proving that the frontier justice system was not designed to rehabilitate, but to biologically and mentally erase human existence. Finally, completely shatter the triumphant, adrenaline-fueled cinematic climax where the desperate, heavily outnumbered hero miraculously commandeers a pristine, fully loaded Gatling gun, effortlessly turning the heavy brass crank to unleash a flawless, uninterrupted mechanical wall of highly accurate suppressing fire that instantly mows down an entire army of advancing villains. The modern entertainment complex absolutely demands that you view this early machine gun as a flawless, futuristic superweapon, completely omitting the terrifying, unyielding metallurgical and chemical limitations of 19th century heavy ordnance. The unvarnished, logistical reality of deploying a Model 1866 Gatling gun reveals a massive, incredibly heavy, mathematically fragile piece of complex clockwork that required a highly trained, coordinated team of men simply to prevent it from instantly tearing itself completely apart. The directors completely sanitized the horrific, highly corrosive chemical properties of the black powder ammunition utilized by these weapons. When the hero rapidly cranks the cinematic handle, he is supposedly firing hundreds of rounds a minute. The absolute, unyielding thermodynamic truth is that after a mere 30 seconds of sustained kinetic fire, the massive, localized accumulation of thick, heavy black powder fouling and highly abrasive carbon residue violently coats the delicate internal rotary mechanisms. This aggressive chemical buildup mathematically guarantees a catastrophic, instantaneous mechanical jam. The heavy brass cartridges would violently warp and completely fuse inside the rapidly expanding, superheated steel barrels, instantly locking the entire massive iron mechanism completely solid. Furthermore, the Gatling gun was completely devoid of any localized internal cooling system. The immense, sustained thermodynamic friction generated by the rapid discharge of heavy lead slugs caused the cluster of steel barrels to violently overheat in a matter of seconds, reaching temperatures capable of instantly cooking human flesh and mathematically guaranteeing catastrophic barrel warpage. When this massive, localized kinetic weapon inevitably failed on the battlefield, the hero was not left with a cinematic advantage. He was completely, biologically anchored to a useless, smoking, 1,000-pound brass anchor in the absolute center of a hostile kill zone, desperately attempting to pry melted copper out of a boiling steel chamber while the enemy aggressively advanced, proving unequivocally that the technological miracles of the Wild West were often the exact, rusted iron instruments that mathematically sealed a man's localized biological doom. Completely and unequivocally eradicate the highly choreographed, wildly entertaining, and deeply sanitized cinematic hallucination of the classic frontier saloon brawl, the visually intoxicating Hollywood set piece where rugged, charismatic cowboys cheerfully smash balsa wood chairs over each other's heads, effortlessly hurl their bodies through pristine plate glass windows, and trade synchronized, perfectly framed punches for 10 straight minutes before wiping a single, aesthetic drop of fake blood from their chins to casually order another shot of whiskey. The modern entertainment complex has spent an entire century relentlessly conditioning you to accept this completely physics-defying theatrical playground, deliberately omitting the terrifying, unyielding biomechanical, metallurgical, and architectural realities of close-quarters combat in the 19th century American West. When you aggressively strip away the stunt coordinators, the breakaway props, and the invisible safety mats, the unvarnished, historical reality of a physical dispute inside a frontier gambling hall reveals a terrifying, claustrophobic nightmare of instantaneous disfigurement, catastrophic blunt force trauma, and mathematically guaranteed biological apocalypse. To fundamentally understand the sheer, suicidal absurdity of the cinematic bar fight, we must first aggressively examine the structural engineering and physical density of frontier carpentry. The directors absolutely demand that you accept the physical impossibility of a man taking a full-force, two-handed swing to the face with a heavy wooden saloon chair and simply shaking his head to clear the cobwebs before throwing a counterpunch. The unyielding historical truth is that the furniture in these remote, makeshift boomtowns was absolutely not constructed from light, hollow, breakaway materials specifically designed by Hollywood prop departments to safely shatter on kinetic impact. This furniture was crudely, brutally fashioned by local blacksmiths and carpenters using massive, solid blocks of raw, unseasoned oak, heavy pine, and thick, forged iron nails. The physical mass and localized kinetic leverage of a 19th century wooden chair was mathematically equivalent to wielding a heavy industrial sledgehammer. If a desperate, adrenaline-fueled man actually weaponized one of these heavy wooden stools and brought it crashing down onto an opponent's skull, the wood absolutely did not theatrically break. Instead, the localized kinetic sledgehammer of the solid oak instantly and violently caved in the fragile human cranium. This catastrophic transfer of physical energy mathematically guaranteed a massive, irreversible cerebral hemorrhage, instantly shattering the orbital bones, aggressively compressing the frontal lobe, and dropping the victim into the blood-soaked sawdust in a state of immediate, permanent biological termination, completely devoid of any cinematic heroism or a miraculous second wind. Equally terrifying and completely sanitized by the silver screen is the ubiquitous, visually spectacular stunt of violently throwing a rival gambler backward through a saloon window. The directors relentlessly utilize this trope to transition the fight from the interior of the bar into the dusty street, completely ignoring the horrifying metallurgical reality of 19th century glass production. Plate glass in the American frontier was an incredibly expensive, highly impure, and dangerously brittle luxury item that had to be transported thousands of miles in heavy wooden freight wagons over completely unforgiving terrain. Because of its structural imperfections and extreme thickness, this glass absolutely did not shatter into the thousands of harmless, rounded, cinematic cubes utilized in modern movie stunts. When a human body was violently accelerated through a frontier window pane, the heavy silica violently broke into massive, incredibly heavy, jagged shards that mathematically acted like localized, falling guillotines. Launching a man through one of these windows was not a comedic combat maneuver. It was an act of absolute, gruesome butchery. As the heavy glass shards violently rained down upon the victim, they would instantly, aggressively sever major arteries, completely slice through the delicate brachial plexus of the arms, and mathematically guarantee that the man would violently bleed to death on the wooden boardwalk in a matter of agonizing seconds, his cellular tissue completely drained of oxygen before a terrified frontier doctor could even be summoned from across the street. When the heavy iron firearms jammed, ran dry, or were violently knocked away in the suffocating, unventilated darkness of a saloon dispute, the desperate men who actually survived the Badlands absolutely did not engage in the polite, Marquis of Queensberry boxing techniques depicted by highly trained actors. There was no bouncing on the toes, no tactical blocking, and no honorable trading of jabs. Instead, these men instantly reverted to a horrifying, completely unregulated, and sociopathic fighting style historically documented as rough and tumble, or simply gouging. This was a brutal, localized application of maximum biomechanical destruction, where the absolute, singular primary objective was not to politely knock your opponent unconscious, but to permanently, physically maim them in the absolute fastest way biologically possible. Desperate men locked in a frantic, rolling, suffocating struggle in the freezing mud of the street or the rotting floorboards of the saloon would aggressively, mathematically utilize their thumbs to violently pry the eyeballs completely out of their opponent's skull. They would physically, biologically, bite off ears, noses, and fingers with their raw teeth, and utilize sharpened metal belt buckles or heavy iron boot heels to aggressively lacerate the soft tissue of the face and throat. This absolute mechanical ruthlessness mathematically ensured that even if a man miraculously survived the immediate kinetic encounter, he was left as a permanently blinded, horrifyingly disfigured outcast for the rest of his agonizing life, his biological existence completely shattered by a few seconds of primal, unedited frontier violence. But the absolute, undisputed apex predator of this close-quarters, blood-soaked nightmare was not the human fist, nor was it the heavy wooden chair. It was the heavy, terrifyingly ubiquitous instrument of frontier survival, universally known as the Bowie knife. Hollywood relentlessly portrays knife fights as elegant, cinematic duels where agile men gracefully parry, thrust, and dodge like classically trained European fencers, completely ignoring the heavy, crude, and devastating reality of American carbon steel. The historical Bowie knife, or its equally terrifying double-edged cousin, the Arkansas toothpick, was absolutely not a delicate, lightweight tactical blade. It was a massive, 2-pound slab of rusted, roughly sharpened iron, essentially functioning as a localized machete specifically designed to violently hack through heavy canvas dusters, dense animal bone, and thick human muscle with absolute, unyielding mechanical leverage. There was absolutely no cinematic defense, no graceful blocking against this weapon. A true frontier knife fight was a panicked, suffocating, and incredibly brief collision of flailing limbs where both men were instantly, catastrophically lacerated. The massive blade did not simply make clean surgical incisions. The heavy, thick spine of the weapon violently ripped and tore through the biological tissue, aggressively dragging filthy, sweat-soaked wool, rotting sawdust, and microscopic animal feces from the combatants' unwashed clothing directly deep into the open abdominal cavity. The ruthless, hardened men who deployed these heavy iron blades mathematically understood the brutal reality of human anatomy. You did not need to instantly pierce the heart or the brain to win the physical altercation. You simply had to violently open the stomach lining and let the horrific, unyielding laws of 19th century microbiology finish the job for you. Because even if a man managed to mathematically win the physical struggle and fatally plunge his own knife into his attacker's throat, the deep, unsterilized lacerations he inevitably sustained on his own arms and torso mathematically guaranteed a terrifying, slow-motion biological apocalypse. The frontier doctor, arriving on the scene and operating on a filthy, blood-stained wooden table with hands heavily caked in dried horse blood and the bacteria of previous patients, would simply take a crude iron needle threaded with unwashed, rigid horsehair and violently stitch the jagged, contaminated flaps of flesh tightly together. This primitive, horrific medical procedure completely sealed the massive, localized bacterial infection deep inside the body's dark, warm ecosystem. Without a single drop of modern antibiotics or any fundamental understanding of germ theory, The victor of the knife fight was mathematically condemned to a horrifying, agonizing demise weeks after the actual blood was spilled. Their cellular tissue would violently rot from the inside out as raging septicemia and aggressive gangrene slowly, methodically shut down every major biological organ in a terrifyingly painful cascade of complete physiological failure. For the cold-blooded operators, syndicate enforcers, and professional card mechanics who wanted to completely avoid the messy, highly visible biological aftermath of a massive arterial bleed, they relied entirely on the most terrifying, completely ignored weapon of the frontier underworld, the heavy leather slungshot. Hollywood completely erases this crude, silent instrument of absolute blunt force trauma, preferring to show villains lazily using the butts of their revolvers to politely knock heroes unconscious for a convenient, temporary scene transition. The biomechanical reality of striking a human skull with the heavy, unyielding iron frame of a Colt peacemaker is that you do not induce a peaceful, temporary sleep. You violently fracture the skull plate and mathematically cause lethal, irreversible brain swelling. But the slungshot, a massive, localized chunk of raw, heavy lead specifically sewn into a flexible, hardened leather pouch and attached to a short, durable wrist strap, was engineered for unparalleled quiet and mathematically devastating destruction. A saloon bouncer or a ruthless back-alley footpad could completely conceal this weapon inside the palm of his hand, rendering him completely non-threatening to the naked eye. But with a single, short, violently snapping motion of the wrist, the user could deliver an acoustic dampening, catastrophic kinetic shock wave directly to the fragile temple or the base of the skull of an unruly patron. The massive, concentrated weight of the lead violently transferred its kinetic payload through the bone, instantly collapsing the central nervous system, aggressively short-circuiting the brainstem, and dropping a massive, heavily armed cowboy completely dead in his tracks without spilling a single drop of highly visible blood onto the wooden floorboards, allowing the killer to simply drag the biological remains into the dark alleyway undetected. And when the violence required gunpowder but completely lacked the geographical space for a heavy cavalry revolver, the true kings of the gambling halls utilized a weapon that the modern entertainment complex treats as a comical joke: the Remington Model 95 double-barrel Derringer. The silver screen has relentlessly conditioned us to view these tiny, palm-sized pistols as harmless novelties carried only by saloon girls, completely ignoring the agonizing, close-quarters devastation inflicted by a massive, .41 caliber rimfire cartridge detonating at a distance of 3 inches. When a seasoned, cold-blooded gambler realized the deck was stacked and the situation was violently deteriorating, he absolutely did not stand up, flip over the heavy wooden table, and dramatically challenge his opponent to step outside into the sunlight for a fair duel. He simply, silently slipped his hand into his tailored vest pocket, quietly cocked the heavy spur hammer of his hidden Derringer, and fired the weapon straight through the heavy wool of his own jacket directly into the stomach of the man sitting across the green felt. The incredible, horrifying physics of these pocket guns meant that the extremely slow, heavy, unjacketed lead projectile lacked the aerodynamic velocity to cleanly pass through a human body or shatter a heavy spinal column. Instead, it lethally tumbled, yawed, and viciously tore through the soft abdominal tissue, aggressively dragging burning fibers from the shooter's coat and the victim's filthy, unwashed shirt directly into the massive wound channel. This terrifying lack of over-penetration meant that the target biologically absorbed 100% of the weapon's kinetic shock. They dropped instantly to the sawdust-covered floor, not in a clean, cinematic fade to black, but in a thrashing, frantic, screaming panic, their unwashed clothes frequently catching completely on fire from the point-blank, localized muzzle flash of the highly combustible black powder. This is the rusted, blood-soaked, and mathematically unyielding mechanical reality of the Wild West that the algorithm desperately tries to sanitize. It is a history completely devoid of fair warnings, polite fistfights, and noble standoffs, forged entirely in the panicked, deafening, and violently claustrophobic shadows of the American borderlands, where the absolute deadliest weapon a man could carry was the localized kinetic violence he could completely conceal until it was entirely biologically too late for his opponent to even realize the fight had begun. Completely and permanently eradicate the deeply comforting, highly sanitized cinematic illusion of the frontier gunshot wound. The visually intoxicating, heavily edited Hollywood sequence where the rugged hero takes a heavy-caliber bullet directly to the shoulder, stoically downs a single, dramatic shot of rot-gut whiskey, bites down on a clean leather strap, and watches calmly as a kindly, bespectacled town doctor expertly extracts a pristine piece of silver lead with a pair of sterile tweezers. The modern entertainment complex has relentlessly conditioned you to accept this mathematically impossible medical fantasy, allowing the hero to miraculously mount his horse and ride back into the kinetic chaos of battle the very next morning with nothing but a neat white bandage. When you aggressively strip away the heroic orchestral swells, the fake blood, and the completely fabricated resilience of the human anatomy, the unvarnished, microbiological, and biomechanical reality of absorbing a 19th century black powder round reveals a terrifying, mathematically guaranteed biological apocalypse. To fundamentally understand the absolute physiological devastation of frontier combat, you must critically examine the unyielding metallurgy of 19th century ballistics. The weapons of the era did not fire the sleek, aerodynamic, copper-jacketed projectiles utilized by modern militaries. They fired massive, heavy, incredibly slow-moving slugs of pure, unjacketed soft lead. When a .45 caliber lead projectile traveling at subsonic velocities impacted the human body, it absolutely did not make a clean, surgical puncture wound. Upon impacting the biological tissue, the soft lead violently expanded, flattened, and aggressively pancaked, instantly transferring 100% of its massive kinetic energy directly into the victim. If this heavy projectile struck the femur, the humerus, or the rib cage, it did not simply break the bone. The immense, localized kinetic shockwave aggressively pulverized the skeletal structure, instantly transforming the human bone into hundreds of jagged, localized secondary projectiles that violently shredded the surrounding internal organs from the inside out. Furthermore, this massive kinetic deformation acted as a terrifying, localized biological vacuum. As the heavy lead tore through the victim's clothing, it aggressively dragged filthy, sweat-soaked wool, rotting prairie dust, highly corrosive black powder residue, and microscopic animal feces from the Cowboys' unwashed duster directly deep into the open abdominal cavity or the shattered muscle tissue. And the desperate men tasked with repairing this catastrophic, completely contaminated kinetic trauma were absolutely not the sterile, highly educated medical professionals depicted on the silver screen. Frontier medicine was a brutal, completely unregulated system of unvarnished butchery, completely devoid of any fundamental understanding of germ theory. When a wounded, screaming man was violently thrown onto a filthy, blood-stained wooden saloon table, the local doctor did not scrub his hands with antibacterial soap. He immediately and aggressively plunged his bare, unwashed fingers heavily contaminated with the microscopic bacteria of previous autopsies, rotting teeth, and his own horses, directly into the gaping, bleeding wound channel. He would blindly and agonizingly dig through the torn, fully innervated muscle fibers in a desperate, primitive, and excruciatingly painful attempt to physically locate the deformed piece of lead. And the ubiquitous cinematic myth of whiskey acting as an effective frontier anesthesia is a terrifying, mathematically lethal lie. High-proof grain alcohol acts as a severe biological vasodilator. It aggressively thins the victim's blood, artificially opens the capillaries, and exponentially accelerates massive, catastrophic hemorrhaging, mathematically ensuring that the patient violently bled out on the wooden table significantly faster than if he had consumed absolutely nothing at all. If a heavy lead slug successfully shattered a major extremity, there was absolutely no cinematic rehabilitation, no physical therapy, and no complex bone setting. The unyielding mathematical medical protocol of the frontier mandated immediate, unceremonious, and aggressive amputation to stop the rapid, localized spread of cellular death. The frontier surgeon would produce a heavy, rusted iron bone saw, frequently completely caked in the dried biological matter and congealed blood of previous, anonymous amputees, and begin violently hacking through the living, fully innervated bone, the thick muscle tissue, and the massive nerve clusters without a single drop of true chemical anesthesia. The agonizing, localized neurological trauma of this barbaric, unsterilized procedure frequently caused the victim's central nervous system to completely and violently crash, dropping them into fatal, irreversible physiological shock, and mathematically killing them from pure, unadulterated biomechanical pain before the limb was even fully severed from the torso. For the unfortunate, completely doomed souls who possessed the terrifying biological fortitude to mathematically survive the initial kinetic trauma of the bullet and the unsterilized butchery of the surgical table, they were merely trading a fast, ballistic death for a horrifying, slow-motion microbiological decay. Without a single unit of modern antibiotics to deploy against the heavily contaminated wound channel, the massive, localized bacterial infection tightly sutured inside their bodies immediately triggered a relentless, biological war they could not possibly win. Within a matter of days, the wound would turn a horrifying, gangrenous black, aggressively necrotizing the surrounding cellular tissue and filling the claustrophobic medical tent with the suffocating, inescapable, deeply sweet stench of rotting human flesh. The victim would slowly descend into a terrifying, boiling fever of violent septic delirium, their internal organs systematically shutting down one by one, ultimately dying in an agonizing, completely unacknowledged madness. But the unyielding biological meat grinder of the American frontier was absolutely not limited to the kinetic trauma of the gunfight. It extended directly into the suffocating, deeply sanitized Hollywood illusion of the frontier saloon girl. The modern algorithm relentlessly demands that you visualize these women as glamorous, highly independent, corseted dancers with hearts of gold, playfully entertaining rugged cowboys while maintaining pristine physical health in beautifully wallpapered, brilliantly illuminated casinos. The unvarnished, heavily suppressed historical reality of the 19th century boomtown sex trade was a ruthless, completely unregulated ecosystem of absolute economic slavery, unimaginable physical trauma, and catastrophic microbiological decay. The vast majority of these desperate women absolutely did not work in massive, cinematic saloons. They were mathematically confined to the absolute lowest, most degrading, and architecturally terrifying structures of the frontier underworld, the cribs. These were microscopic, uninsulated, wildly unsanitary wooden shacks, barely large enough to hold a single, filthy mattress, completely devoid of ventilation, running water, or basic thermodynamic heating. In the freezing sub-zero winters of the Dakota Territories, or the suffocating humid summers of Texas, these women were forcefully subjected to servicing dozens of unwashed, aggressive, parasite-ridden men every single night in a localized environment that reeked overwhelmingly of stale rot-gut whiskey, rotting floorboards, and catastrophic human misery. The directors completely sanitized the terrifying, mathematical guarantee of frontier intimacy before the miraculous invention of penicillin. The boomtowns were raging, localized, completely unchecked epicenters of incurable venereal diseases, and contracting 19th-century syphilis was an absolute, inescapable biological death sentence. The progression of this devastating bacterial infection was not a polite, cinematic illness. It was a slow-motion, horrifying destruction of the human organism from the inside out. The bacteria aggressively consumed the biological tissue, eating completely away the nasal cartilage, causing horrific, highly visible facial disfigurement that instantly turned the women into unemployable outcasts, and ultimately invading the central nervous system to induce permanent, violent, screening dementia. The only terrifying, primitive medical recourse available to these desperate women was not a healing, soothing salve, but the aggressive, localized application of highly toxic heavy metals. Frontier doctors routinely prescribed violent daily ingestions of raw liquid mercury or physically injected the toxic metal directly into the women's biological tissue using massive, unsterilized glass syringes. This horrific chemical cure was mathematically worse than the disease itself, triggering acute, heavy metal toxicity that caused the women's teeth to violently fall out and their jawbones to literally necrotize and rot completely out of their skulls. To psychologically and biologically endure this relentless, inescapable gauntlet of physical abuse and terminal disease, the women relied entirely on a highly accessible, completely legal, and catastrophically addictive chemical solution, laudanum. This highly concentrated, localized tincture of pure, raw opium, aggressively dissolved in high-proof alcohol, was consumed in massive quantities simply to completely numb the central nervous system and mathematically dissociate from the horrific reality of the cribs, resulting in an epidemic of absolute, fatal chemical dependency, where severe respiratory depression and localized overdoses were the leading, unrecorded cause of death. And for the hardened men who operated in this brutal ecosystem and ultimately found themselves completely devoid of localized political protection, the ultimate, terrifying reality of the West awaited them not in a fair gunfight, but upon the unyielding thermodynamic architecture of the execution scaffold. You must completely dismantle the solemn, dignified cinematic hallucination of the great frontier hanging, where the stoic outlaw stands upon a massive, perfectly constructed wooden platform, delivers a brilliant final monologue, and drops with a clean, synchronized, instantly fatal crack of the neck. When you aggressively strip away the stunt coordinators, the physics of 19th-century frontier justice reveal a terrifying, mathematically chaotic nightmare of absolute, agonizing biological strangulation. The silver screen expects you to believe that every single frontier boomtown possessed the highly advanced engineering capabilities required to execute the long drop, a highly specific, scientific execution technique that mathematically required calculating the exact weight of the condemned man against the specific drop distance to generate the precise kinetic energy needed to instantly snap the second and third cervical vertebrae. The historical reality of the Badlands was that local sheriffs and vigilante posses possessed absolutely zero understanding of this complex biological arithmetic. The scaffolds were hastily, crudely constructed from green, violently warping pine, and the ropes were stiff, highly abrasive, and completely untested for localized kinetic shock absorption. Because they lacked the mathematical precision to engineer a clean spinal fracture, the vast majority of frontier hangings were horrifying, chaotic, short drops. A desperate outlaw was simply forced to stand on the back of a wooden freight wagon with a cheap hemp rope violently secured to a low-hanging cottonwood branch. When the wagon was abruptly whipped forward, the victim did not experience a clean, cinematic drop. They fell a mere 12 inches, generating absolutely zero kinetic energy to break the neck. This instantly triggered a horrific, agonizing, slow-motion biological nightmare of complete mechanical asphyxiation. The heavy, abrasive hemp rope violently crushed the trachea and aggressively compressed the carotid arteries, but failed to sever the spinal cord. The victim remained completely biologically conscious for up to 20 agonizing minutes, their localized survival instincts triggering a terrifying, violent, thrashing panic as their lungs frantically and hopelessly attempted to draw oxygen against the unyielding mechanical leverage of the noose. The immense, localized hydrostatic pressure inside the skull caused the blood vessels in the face and eyes to violently rupture, turning the skin a horrifying, swollen, dark purple, while the autonomic nervous system completely collapsed, causing the catastrophic, involuntary release of the bladder and bowels directly in front of the cheering, localized mob. On the rare, terrifying occasions when a frontier town actually attempted to construct a massive, cinematic scaffold, their complete lack of kinetic understanding frequently resulted in an even more horrific biological disaster. If the local sheriff mathematically overestimated the drop distance, the resulting catastrophic application of extreme kinetic force at the exact bottom of the drop did not simply break the vertebrae. It possessed the absolute, undeniable physical leverage to violently and completely decapitate the condemned man, sending the severed head violently bouncing into the horrified, blood-splattered crowd, and leaving the torso to collapse into the dirt in a geyser of arterial spray, proving unequivocally that the American West was not a theater of honor, but an unyielding, unforgiving meat grinder of absolute biological and mechanical terror. Completely and utterly obliterate the visually comforting, deeply romanticized cinematic hallucination of the great American cowboy, the universally worshipped Hollywood myth where a rugged, soft-spoken hero gently strums a pristine acoustic guitar around a crackling campfire, singing mournful ballads to a peacefully sleeping herd of cattle before waking up to drink hot coffee and ride effortlessly across a sun-drenched, painted landscape. The modern entertainment complex absolutely demands that you accept this sanitized, heavily filtered agricultural fantasy, deliberately conditioning you to view the 19th century cattle drive as a noble, character-building adventure, completely devoid of localized physical agony. When you aggressively strip away the orchestral soundtracks and the theatrical dusters, the unvarnished, biomechanical and neurological reality of moving 3,000 half-wild Texas longhorns across 1,000 miles of completely hostile geography reveals a terrifying, completely unregulated corporate meat grinder of catastrophic sleep deprivation, horrific nutritional collapse, and absolute, mathematically guaranteed kinetic terror. To fundamentally understand the absolute physical nightmare of the cattle trail, you must first aggressively dismantle the cinematic illusion of the cowboy's biological endurance. The silver screen relentlessly portrays these men as tireless, heavily resilient biological machines. The unyielding, historical truth is that a 19th century trailhand was a highly expendable, mathematically doomed agricultural laborer subjected to a relentless, agonizing gauntlet of complete neurological exhaustion. The absolute, uncompromising economics of the cattle syndicates mandated that the herd continuously move, meaning these desperate men were physically confined to heavy, completely unergonomic wooden and leather saddles for up to 20 consecutive hours a day. The human central nervous system is biologically incapable of sustaining this localized lack of rapid eye movement sleep. Within the first 2 weeks of the drive, the cowboys' brains would aggressively begin to short-circuit, violently dropping them into localized, uncontrollable micro-sleeps while actively riding massive, heavily muscled prey animals. To combat this absolute, fatal neurological collapse, The hardened men of the frontier did not splash cold water on their faces or drink cinematic black coffee. They resorted to horrifying, self-inflicted biological torture. When the crushing weight of exhaustion threatened to mathematically drop them from the saddle into the unyielding dirt, desperate cowboys would aggressively take raw, highly caustic, unrefined chewing tobacco and violently rub the toxic alkaline plant matter directly into their own bloodshot tear ducts. The resulting catastrophic, localized burning sensation and acute physiological trauma artificially spiked their adrenaline levels, forcing their violently protesting central nervous systems to remain conscious just long enough to see the sunrise. The penalty for failing this brutal neurological battle was absolute biological erasure. Falling from a moving horse in the pitch-black darkness of the prairie mathematically guaranteed being instantly swallowed by the crushing, unyielding weight of the massive herd behind them. But the absolute, undisputed apex terror of the frontier cattle drive was not the slow, agonizing decay of the mind. It was the deafening, instantaneous, and mathematically apocalyptic kinetic nightmare of the midnight stampede. Hollywood relentlessly sanitizes this terrifying mechanical reality, depicting stampedes as chaotic but easily manageable dust clouds, where the heroic trail boss safely gallops alongside the herd, shouting commands and firing his revolver into the air to politely steer the cattle back into a circle. The unvarnished, unyielding physical thermodynamics of 3,000 spooked Texas longhorns completely shatters this childish cinematic delusion. These animals were not docile, modern dairy cows. They were massive, highly aggressive, 2-ton biological bulldozers armed with 6-foot spans of heavy, razor-sharp, localized keratin. When a massive, violent thermodynamic weather system rolled across the plains, or a single localized lightning strike aggressively shattered the acoustic silence of the night, the entire herd's prey-drive nervous system would violently and instantaneously overload. In a fraction of a second, thousands of massive animals would unconditionally panic, mathematically transforming the herd into an unstoppable, deafening, localized kinetic avalanche. The acoustic shockwave of 10,000 heavy hooves simultaneously striking the unyielding prairie dirt literally caused the earth to violently shudder, completely masking the terrified screams of the men caught in its path. If a cowboy's horse mathematically misjudged the pitch-black terrain and violently snapped its fragile leg in a hidden prairie dog hole, there was absolutely no heroic cinematic roll to safety. The exact microsecond the rider hit the ground, the massive, uncompromising mechanical weight of the herd aggressively washed over him. The dense, unyielding keratin hooves of the longhorns did not simply trample the victim. The absolute localized kinetic mass violently pulverized the human skeletal structure into microscopic fragments, aggressively compressed the rib cage until the internal organs catastrophically ruptured, and literally, biologically ground the human cellular tissue into an unrecognizable, blood-soaked paste directly into the unforgiving mud. When the sun finally rose, the surviving cowboys would frequently find absolutely nothing mathematically large enough to bury, visually proving that the true ruler of the plains was the unyielding, apocalyptic physics of mass and momentum. Furthermore, we must completely eradicate the comforting, deeply sanitized cinematic illusion of the chuck wagon, heavily portrayed as a rustic, rolling kitchen serving hearty stews, fresh biscuits, and nourishing meals that kept the rugged heroes in peak physical condition. The directors absolutely refused to film the horrific, microbiological nightmare of the frontier agricultural diet. The vast, uncharted territories were completely devoid of any localized agricultural infrastructure, meaning the cowboys survived on an absolute, mathematically catastrophic diet of heavily salted pork, dried pinto beans, and rock-hard flour biscuits for months on end. This completely unregulated, highly restricted caloric intake completely deprived the human body of a single, vital chemical necessity: ascorbic acid. The human biological machine absolutely requires vitamin C to continuously synthesize collagen, the fundamental cellular glue that mathematically holds the biological tissue, the blood vessels, and the skeletal structure together. Without it, the Cowboys were completely subjected to the horrifying, slow-motion biological apocalypse of acute scurvy. This was not a polite cinematic weakness. It was a terrifying, aggressive, physiological dismantling of the human body. As the collagen production catastrophically collapsed, the Cowboys' gums would turn a horrifying, gangrenous black and violently necrotized, causing their perfectly healthy teeth to loosen and simply fall directly out of their rotting mouths into their tin plates. But the absolute most terrifying, unvarnished reality of frontier scurvy was its catastrophic effect on the localized cellular history of the body. Without collagen to maintain scar tissue, old, fully healed physical traumas, massive knife lacerations, broken bones, and decades-old gunshot wounds would literally, mathematically dissolve and violently reopen, causing the desperate men to spontaneously and aggressively hemorrhage from wounds they had suffered years before they ever set foot on the trail. And when these physically shattered, neurologically destroyed, and biologically decaying men finally reached the massive, heavily armed railhead boom towns of Abilene or Dodge City, they did not engage in the cinematic, highly choreographed saloon celebrations heavily depicted by the modern algorithm. They mathematically entered a new, highly concentrated gauntlet of localized biological terror. The cattle towns were heavily engineered, hyper-capitalist traps explicitly designed to aggressively extract every single hard-earned silver dollar from the exhausted laborers before they could physically return to Texas. The men, completely biologically desperate for any localized dopamine release after months of absolute kinetic agony, were immediately funneled into horrific, unventilated gambling halls heavily saturated with toxic rot-gut whiskey deliberately cut with raw strychnine and highly corrosive chewing tobacco juice to artificially increase its intoxicating effects. The resulting chemical mixture completely and violently short-circuited the Cowboys' already fragile central nervous systems, frequently triggering localized, aggressive psychotic breaks and completely chaotic, completely inaccurate thermodynamic firefights in the suffocating darkness of the streets. The true, blood-soaked history of the American cowboy was absolutely not forged by romantic campfire songs and honorable gunfights. It was brutally hammered out by completely expendable, physically rotting agricultural laborers fighting an absolutely unwinnable, mathematically doomed war against sleep deprivation, catastrophic kinetic crush injuries, and the horrifying, localized microbiological collapse of their own cellular tissue, leaving their shattered, anonymous bones scattered across the Chisholm Trail as silent, unacknowledged physical receipts for the wealthy Eastern syndicates.